Okay. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to be able to Zoom with you all and have the silver lining that we are in many different parts of the country, but we're able to join in this important New England Northeastern gathering. And let's hope that next year and in the future we might be able to get together in person, but this is a good stand-in for the time. My name is Sarah Lloyd. I'm a dairy farmer from Wisconsin, and I also am a board member of the Wisconsin Farmers Union. My day job is I work for the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota looking at supply chains for regenerative and resilient agriculture. So I am here, I'm going to kind of moderate the session, but we're going to talk here about concepts of parity. There is an initiative called Disparity to Parity, and so we're jumping off from that initiative. Very excited to have Dania Davey here, who's the Land Retention and Advocacy Director at the Federation of Southern Co-ops and the Land Assistance Fund. We also have Mary Hendrickson here from the University of Missouri. She's an associate professor, rural sociologist. Woohoo! And so what we're going to do is I will give a kind of a intro to the Disparity to Parity initiative and the concept of parity. I will share a little bit about from a dairy farmer perspective, what we're working on in seeking fairness and viability. And then Dania Davey will talk next about the work that she's involved with. And then Mary Hendrickson will share her work. And then we are leaving time, 15 to 20 minutes at the end for discussion and Q&A. So it's great that we have a nice bunch here, but not so big, and we can really have a discussion. So with that, I think I'll kick things off. I was just going to share my screen to orient you to the Disparity to Parity website, just because I think it's important. There's quite a good set of information there. And now, of course, I tried so hard to get it separated so I could find it. And here we go. Yes, so if you can see this, you know, I see that we put it in the chat, disparitytoparity.org. This is a great initiative with a mix of folks from the farming community, the activist community, the advocacy community, and academics and university folks that came together to really call for a new movement, a revival of the movement to get policies and actions that would create fairness, empowerment, and especially in this climate crisis, how are we building a food system that will be part of that solution? So I encourage you to check it out. There are essays and blog posts from a range of folks that talk about what's going on. And so I just want to start by giving kind of some definitions of parity so that we can start on with that base. So, you know, parity is a concept that has been around in US policy conversations for, well, over 100 years, in the sense that it was a way that we were farmers were measuring the price that they were being paid for their product. So I'm a dairy farmer. So how much do I get paid for the milk that I produce? And how does that compare with what I have to pay for all of the inputs that I need to be able to produce that? And so that was kind of my buying power. And then that was linked to what consumers or sort of non-farm people were experiencing in their buying power. So the idea was that from a farmer perspective, that farmers could achieve a livelihood and a living with the prices paid for their products that would be matched or on par with what non-farm households could achieve. So that was the underlying idea of why we care, because it was about people being able to have a livelihood, both on the farm and in non-farm communities. So there is, just for folks who like to geek out on stats and maps and graphs, you know, the USDA actually does, let's see, I've got to find it here. The USDA actually tracks this on a really ongoing basis. So I've just found one of the most recent measurements, and I just want to show it to you because it's something that you can take a look at. So, you know, I went to the USDA National Ag Statistics Service, and for example, what they do is they index the prices paid. So that is that. So this is a little confusing. So the prices paid is what I paid as a farmer for all of my inputs, and the prices received is what I received for my product. And you can, they separate it out by individual commodities, and then they also lump it all together. So this particular graph shows you that, you know, for all of US crops and commodities, this is kind of my house always wins slide, because even when I might be getting like a slightly higher price for my product, I'm consistently, and especially in these last years, and we see this over history, that I'm paying more for the inputs that I need to produce my product, which means that I can't make a living as a farmer. So, you know, if you're interested in this, there's lots of ways that you can track it. You can grab the raw numbers. The Economic Research Service at the USDA does reports on this, and there's a consistent NASS survey. Now, so that's the basics of, you know, the concept of parity. What I want to just briefly tell you about and encourage you to join in is, you know, dairy farmers are struggling mightily. Like all farmers, regardless of crops, we have really struggled with low prices that are in no way covering our input costs. You are seeing mass exit of farmers, but you are seeing a continued production. So we're not reducing our productions as we lose farms. We're just losing the small and medium-sized farms that really form the backbone or the engine of our rural communities, both economically and socially. And so that's the danger by not addressing these issues. And when we talk about parity, the disparity to parity movement is also really wanting to highlight that we should be talking about disparity to parity to solidarity, disparity to parity to equity, because as we know, over history in the US, our policies have disproportionately negatively impacted communities of color, indigenous communities, and we must right that wrong, because we need everyone to be able to succeed, and we need to give people a hand up. And that's what this kind of thinking about fairness of pricing is. But we know that if we raise the price paid to farmers, if we just said, hey, like my cost of production is $18.50 to make 100 pounds of milk. So, okay, government, like set that price at $20. But what will happen if we don't also add in a layer of managing the supply, that all the production will just rush in to meet that higher price. And so I am involved in, and folks here, in an effort called Dairy Together. You can check it out at dairytogether.com. This is a national movement, a farmer-led movement that's working on the mechanism to deal with supply management that could be paired with a fair pricing mechanism. And because, especially in dairy, the US government is so involved in the pricing, we have to have a federal policy solution. So, a lot of people say, oh, forget about the government. It's so gridlocked. Yes, but because of the way we've historically done pricing, we really must have that. And so Dairy Together is about bringing farmers together, farm organizations, and we actually have price policy mechanisms that could do a very good job of basically just like matching supply with demand. There are existing systems in the US, even like cranberry growers, potato growers, they do that. It's not a two-headed monster, it exists. And so, but the biggest thing is we have to build the political power, because I'm just constantly amazed by talking to people about these kind of mechanisms where you could put the brakes on production when there's too much milk, in the dairy case, coming into the market and glutting out the prices. And people know that that would work, that you could figure out ways of disincentivizing the overproduction with the way the pricing structure. But they say, oh, well, we know that that would work, but it's not politically possible. But these are powerful people telling me that it's not politically possible. I'm like, well, you could make it politically possible by actually publicly saying what you just said, which is that this would work. This is a thing that would work. And so, it's up to us to continue to put the pressure on our congressional leaders to say, look, we know that the system is broken. The pricing system is not paying people a fair price so that they can make a living. And the other thing that happens, and so this is sort of my charge to all of you, what we are often told in these political discussions is that, well, if farmers get paid a higher price, that's automatically going to raise the price that the consumers are going to have to pay. And this is what I know Mary will tell us some more about later, but they will constantly try to pit the farmers and the consumers, the eaters, against each other, because that's really politically smart of them. But if I get paid a higher price, that does not necessarily have to result in a higher consumer price, because we know that the retailers, the distributors, the processors that are becoming increasingly powerful and concentrated in their monopoly and monopsony power, they are hanging on to more than their fair share of the food dollar. And so we cannot allow them to say, oh, well, that'll raise prices to consumers, so we can't give farmers a higher price. That's not true. And it's up to us to really push back hard on that. So obviously there's tons more to talk about, and dairy is especially problematic example because it is very complicated the way that the pricing is structured. But for anyone who is not knee deep in the dairy pricing weeds, just know that don't let them tell you that the consumer and farmers need to be at odds with each other. We actually need to bring each other together. The other part of this is that as a farmer, I am interested in eaters being paid good wages for their work so that they can easily afford good food and my good products. So the other thing is like, let's also raise consumer buying power through fair wages. And so that's all part of, you know, building a solidarity economy where people, real people, can build good and fair livelihoods. So that's what I'm interested in. Dairy Together is an example of a national farmer-led movement that's bringing our voices together to demand real change so that we can keep more farmers on the land and not fewer. So I'll leave it at that. And encourage you all, you know, check out disparity to parity.org and, you know, join this action. And I'm going to pass it over to Dania Davey from the Federation of Southern Co-ops. So take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope you saw me nodding vigorously, agreeing with everything that you were saying. And as Sarah said, I'm Dania Davey. I'm the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. I'm based out of our Atlanta office. And for those of you who don't know, the Federation is a 54-year-old nonprofit association of cooperatives. And our membership primarily consists of Black farmers, cooperatives, and landowners. And this subject, for those of you who are at the plenary that I was at, ending my day yesterday, and I'm starting my day again with the same conference, that you may hear some similarities, but reinforcement, I think, is really what helps get the message across. And so I really like entering this disparity discourse from the lens of a racial equity analysis. And I think just for me personally, this disparity to parity conversation is very relevant because as an immigrant from the island of Jamaica, globalization plays a significant role in people movement throughout the world. And the ways in which the United States makes decisions about pricing have global implications and vast political implications. And so Sarah ended her talk right, you know, hitting the nail right on the head in terms of what's at issue, because the false narrative of dairy farmers versus consumers is a political construct. And so that's kind of where my conversation will direct our thoughts, is really thinking about solidarity, because I think that rural power is really what the threat is to the current system of pricing that we have. And I think rural power transcends so many different lines: race, gender, sexuality, ability, age. And the thought of those people coalescing and galvanizing and demanding what we really need as a nation threatens the status quo. And it's really important to think about the role of history in these disparities in particular. And I think the African-American community is almost a case study, because our community is kind of the canary in the mine shaft, right? Because the things that have detrimentally impacted African-Americans, there's solidarity across racial lines, because all small farmers, regardless of race, are now experiencing some of the very detrimental impacts of the intentional, institutionalized race-based discrimination that African Americans have faced. So I kind of like to start this talk by thinking just about the reality that when the Constitution was drafted, African Americans were legally classified as property. So that in and of itself is something that makes us realize the power of policy to even define what humanity and citizenship is or isn't. And so whenever you see, you get the response from elected officials about how things can be really complicated, if over the course of this nation's history, we can have a people going from being defined as property to people with citizenship rights and political rights, there's a lot of power in the people. There's a lot of power in solidarity, and there's a lot of power in our work to shift the paradigm. In 1910, roughly 218,000 Black farmers had acquired 15 million acres of land, but by 1992, there were only 18,000 Black farmers remaining, and they owned only 2.3 million acres of land. And Sarah was talking about the impact of parity on farmers. I'm only aware, and I've been doing this work for a little while now, and I'm only aware of one African-American owned dairy farm that's left in this country. So African Americans have experienced a drastic decline in both farms, farmers, and farmland ownership. And there is a disparity there just in land ownership, because from 1993 to 2003, approximately 94% of Black farmers lost all or part of their land. And that was 3 times the rate of white farmers for that same period. And, you know, like I said, the Federation came into existence in 1967. And the reason that this organization was founded, we were founded by 22 cooperatively owned Black-owned businesses who were primarily leaders in the Black cooperative development and the civil rights movements, who, because of their political engagement, these were the farmers that were trying to unionize across racial lines. These were the farmers that were engaged in political advocacy to get African Americans voting rights and the ability to live in an integrated society. And because they were independent landowners and independent business owners, they were able to form cooperatives that could ward off the decimation that they were facing. Because one example of intentional acts against the community is in Shirley Sherrod's the New Communities Farm in Southwest Georgia, where there's lots of documented evidence of polluted soil and inputs that their farms were sold just to ensure that the first and largest African American landholding in this country's history would not survive. And so the Federation's work has always been in the reality that African Americans have never been able to fully participate and realize the full benefits of citizenship or fair pricing in agriculture. And the reason I start with the land ownership is that the land ownership is very much correlated and tied to access to credit. And for those of you who are in this discussion, you're probably already aware of this, but the timing that you receive credit is very, very significant for agricultural production. And what has happened historically is, number one, African Americans have faced race-based discrimination in access to credit. And as we know, our credit systems are rooted in wealth, in analysis of wealth. And when you see declines in land ownership, which is a huge indicator of wealth, that correlates directly to disparities in access to credit. So traditional lenders have historically and to this day used race-based bias practices to exclude African Americans. And there are countless studies. I believe there was one that NPR recently done that just show that racial disparities don't make any capitalistic sense, and yet they persist. They've been very persistent. And so it's counterintuitive, but the Black farmers, when they would go to get credit so that they could feed their communities, they wouldn't get that credit. So they would go to the USDA, and historically they would be denied loans, or if they were approved loans, they would get their funding for their loans so late in the season that their white counterparts had already started planting, had already started the process of being in a position to get their crops to market as early as possible. And if you're the first to market, you kind of set the price, you get the best price. And so by the time African Americans were getting to market, they weren't getting the best prices. And this is something that has happened historically, and we see it continue to exist to this day. And all of it is very much connected. As I said, there's a line, if you just track the policies, you can see the line being drawn from the land loss all the way through to disparity and pricing. And I think that one of the ways that the Federation approaches the parity to this disparity to parity narrative is we kind of think that the solidarity step has to come first, because there are many ways in which we work with our allies and our allies support the work that we do, that I think there's this false narrative, and I'll give you a very specific example that's related to policy that shows the way in which these false narratives persist. So over the course of the pandemic, the vast majority of COVID aid and farm subsidies went to white-owned businesses and white-owned farms. Not all white-owned businesses and farms, but the largest and most politically influential white-owned businesses and farms. And African Americans and other socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers basically were excluded from access to those supports. And so these disaster relief supports that were supposed to stabilize our agricultural economy were being doled out in ways that reflected a racial disparity. And so earlier this year in the American Rescue Plan, Section 1005 was passed in March, and it had a emergency relief, emergency debt relief for farmers and ranchers of color. Almost immediately, there was language that came out against that provision, and it was hearkening back to language that always comes up whenever there's any racial equity legislation passed that would benefit farmers of color. And so the buzzword that you have, it's usually a call, and you'll hear this term, reparations. It's usually a scary, it's supposed to scare people into thinking that you're going to lose something because of the debt that the country owes to African Americans. So that's a conversation that has never been had about the debt that's owed for the unpaid labor, the land and lives lost, and the wealth lost to the African American community. So whenever conversations come up around parity, equity, racial equity, you'll hear that term reparations thrown out as a fear tactic. And I say that because along the lines of that term being thrown out, it calls up a certain aspect of anti-Black racism in particular. And as we saw last summer, there's a particular way in which anti-Black racism persists in police brutality, and even in public health, where we see that African Americans disproportionately were impacted, both as being frontline workers, as well as contracting and dying at disparate rates from COVID-19. And so during a time when the African American community was grappling with both the COVID-19 pandemic and the police brutality pandemic, there were folks that were against the Black farmers getting debt relief. And so much so that they didn't really care that the program was emergency debt relief for farmers and ranchers of color, meaning Latin, Asian, all Native farmers and ranchers. The target was African Americans. And so there were about 13 lawsuits filed, the most recent of which was filed in Texas, where it was certified as a class. And their allegation was that the white farmers' 14th Amendment rights were being violated because they were being discriminated against because of their whiteness. And so a lot of the very same language around civil rights, getting African Americans fundamental human and political rights, that language is kind of being co-opted to create this other narrative about white farmers being disadvantaged by anything that is provided intentionally by the government to people of color. Now, that lawsuit has had far-reaching implications, one of which is that the debt relief that was promised, and many of the Black farmers had already received their letters, and so they planned their season in reliance on the debt relief. So they thought they would be able to have those debts forgiven. So they went out and purchased more supplies, more inputs, started their season in reliance on the debt relief. And the judges granted a halt. They provided injunctive relief so that the Section 1005 program would not be implemented. I have a 2-minute warning, so some of this narrative I'll hopefully get to in the Q&A section, but I just wanted to point to the fact that there are ways in which we as a movement, when we hear these calls, when we hear these terms being used to pit African-American farmers against white farmers, it's the same false dichotomy that Sarah was referencing in terms of the discrepancy between farmers and consumers. And whenever we have these dichotomies being presented to us, we need to be very critical, because it's very important that we think small, think very small. It's the small farmers that need the most support. And that's the way that we really galvanize a solidarity across the movement. And I think that the disparity to parity conversation is one that can get us to a place where we have racial equity in agriculture. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll have time for more discussion and Q&A, so this will be great. I'm going to pass the mic over to Mary Hendrickson, and she's got some slides to share with us.
Sorry, I was muted there for a minute. So thank you, everyone. This has been really interesting. And I love the focus on the collective. And I think we have to keep the collective in our minds, because that's the only way to fight what's going on. And so it's the collective, it's all of us working together. And I love the name. It takes a region. I love what the Federation does in terms of we're going to be in this together, collectively working. And I want us to keep that in mind as we go through this. I just want to really talk a little bit about power and equity in the food system and how we may think about gaining more power. So I think it's really important to think about food as something that is special. And it's something that we all need. Everybody needs it every day. And we wrote a report, my colleagues, Phil Howard, myself, and Doug Constance and Emily Miller wrote a report. I've got the link there at the bottom, but really thinking about the distribution of power in the food system, embodying the power to make decisions about what food's produced, how it's produced, by whom, and where, and as well as who gets to eat it. And I think that that is really at the heart of, we have to really address these power issues, because there's been a lot of, the imbalance of power in the food system has caused a lot of negative impacts to farmers, to workers, to communities, and our ecology. And we have to address those if we're going to think about how humanity can be fed in the future. And this is really important in terms of what we're seeing now with climate change and community disarray, all of these things. Food's too important to be left to the market. So let me tell you what the market looks like right now, because it looks pretty darn bad, right? If you start to look at the control over the input market, and Sarah was referencing some of this at the beginning with the prices paid for inputs in that graph she showed. But if these are looking at what's happening in agrochemical, animal pharmaceutical, seeds, synthetic fertilizer, farm equipment, when we see the top 4 firms controlling 40% or more of a market, we start to worry about what kind of power can be exercised in those particular markets. So seeds, we have the top 2 firms actually have significant control over proprietary seeds at the global level. And that is Corteva and Bayer, and of course they've done that through acquisitions. You can go look at Phil Howard's work and see some interesting graphs that show that. But basically, when you go to buy seeds, you don't have much choice. When you go to buy fertilizer, you don't have much choice. So farmers are kind of caught in this squeeze, right? Because when they go to sell those products, they don't have the products they're producing, they don't have much choice either. So you've got concentration ratios of over 40% in most of these markets, if not, and they're like 80% in some, like chicken processing is 54% and beef processing. And by the way, that CR4 should actually read the actual slaughter numbers. It's about 85% for beef processing, soybean processing over 80%, pork 2/3. But the same thing is like, if you want to drink beer, you basically don't have many choices of where you want to, the consumers don't have very many choices about what kind of beer, cereal, soft drinks they want to buy. Now, this has also impacted the way the landscape looks and what communities look like, right? So Sarah was talking about dairy earlier. Well, look at this. In 1987, the median dairy herd size was roughly 80 cows, and now it's 1,300 cows. So that means that there are half of all dairy farms in the US are over 1,300 cattle. In my own case, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, a diversified farm raising corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, prairie hay. We had cattle and hogs and sheep. My brothers and I had sheep. And on that farm in 1987, we marketed about 2,500 head of pigs per year. So that meant we were in the top 50% of producers, right? Because the median marketed about 1,200 pigs per year. Can you see what happened by 2017? We are over 50,000 pigs per farm. That's the median. That's the median. Broilers went from 300,000 up to 700,000. This means that there are a lot less farms out there on the landscape, right? And there's a lot more concentration of animals in particular places. But the same thing has happened on crop farms. You're starting to see that, your general farms of 2,000-3,000 acres. I've got students in my class this year. They're they consider themselves small family farms here in Missouri. Granted, there's 2 or 3 families farming, but it's 8,000 or 9,000 acres. So you can start to see that we don't have as many farms on the landscape, right? And we have more land under the control of fewer people. And then you start to look at, at the grocery level as well. It's 45% of all groceries are sold through 4 firms. The same things you can look at fast food, you can look at wine, beer, ice cream. You can look at all of these things and you can see that the market is very concentrated. So there's not much choice. There's not choice for farmers and where they want to buy their inputs, what they want to produce, because they're dependent on the markets. So this is why we have the lowest crop diversity in the Midwest region. You have a lot more crop diversity in the Northeast, for instance. However, the markets determine choices that farmers can make, and they determine choices that consumers can make. And this is a particular kind of mode of power. So consolidation in the agricultural arena is driven by the quest for power. It's not about scale. It's not about efficiencies of scale. It's not about anything other than the quest for power by the dominant firms. And Phil Howard has the book out, Consolidation in the Food System. Great book. You all should buy it. He re-upped it, and it just came out here in October again. But you can see that this is on the global level. The same kind of thing is happening. So if this is a power issue, then we have to talk about rebalancing power. And the only way we can do that is collectively, right? Collectively. And we have to think about it in the marketplace. We have to think about it in the political sphere. We have to think about it as workers, as farmers, as communities. We have to think about how we are going to rebalance power together. So Breimeyer, and I bring this up here, if individual freedom is a timeless principle, if economic and social institutions are but transitory inventions, i.e. we create them, means we can design institutions end markets that work for us, work for farmers, for consumers, for eaters, I should say, for workers, for communities, for our ecology, because we cannot afford not to have this. Maybe we need to think about food differently. Maybe we need to think about food as commons, right? In a different way. Food is a commons in that its production and distribution responds to a logic of solidarity, mutual help, rather than to the logic of competition and exclusion, because people recognize mutual neediness and the essentiality of eating. So think about food in a different way. It's too important. It cannot be left to the marketplace and the unequal power relationships that are there. So let's think about how we might do this. And it is exactly what Sarah and Danielle were talking about. We have to think about market rules. So maybe we have to rethink antitrust and things like that. Maybe we have to think about public regulations. If food is a common, then it can be regulated as a public good. And then we have to think about collective actions. And to do this, we're going to have think about resilience, right? Resilience of the food system in a changing climate, in a changing community structure, global system. We think we have to think about the latitude to accommodate change, the redundancy of role and function, the diversity of organizational forms, which means we need small, we need large, we need flexibility, we need redundancy, which we need to make many different kinds of things happen at the same time. So, I think that I think that there's small and big steps that we can take. I think that we need to think about competition policy, and there's an opportunity right now in this particular time. People are starting to get worried about the power of tech, the power of food firms, and so on. So we should be thinking about competition policy and how it can rebalance power. We need to rethink what's subsidized and how it's managed. We do not subsidize workers. We do not subsidize Black farmers. We do not, but we subsidize lots of other things. So can we rethink how to do that? But then more importantly is we have to think about transformation. What are the new forms of production consumption relationships that we want collectively? What do we want? What kind of land ownership do we want? Should we have communal land ownership? In fact, private property really doesn't fit with the history of humankind. And we need to think about the fundamental need for food to be considered in every decision. So I want to stop there, and I will post that link, but I think that this is the rebalancing power collectively. We got to do it. Thank you.
Nice. Hear, hear. That was great. Thank you, Professor Hendrickson. So I think this is wonderful. We have a good group here and we've got a lot of time. So maybe what we can do is start, if there's any kind of clarification questions that people want, maybe people could just indicate in the chat or use the raise hand function. And if you want to ask a question or make a statement, maybe try to keep it in the 1.5 to 2 minute range so that everyone can participate. So folks have questions or comments?
There were some comments in the chat.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna go scroll back through the chat here.
So there's a question about the Biden administration's briefing on consolidation and the order addressing ag consolidation. And are these encouraging steps in the right direction? What can we do to shift the needle more here? And what are the key leverage points for pushing systems change? So I think those are all good questions. And I'll just take a stab at the Biden administration's work, and I think that lots of people on this call probably can fill in. I think that they're really trying to attempt some work, that they're taking some things seriously, but this is not something that can be done through the executive branch alone. In fact, I would argue that Congress has to take pretty major steps in this arena. So while I'm impressed with what the Biden administration is trying to do, I think that if we really want significant policy change, this is going to be addressed in all three levels or branches of government. And in particular, we're going to have new policies, because traditional interpretations now that are precedent within the legal system really cannot address the power issues that are happening right now. And we're going to have to rethink policy. And that may not just be through antitrust. Perhaps we rethink contract law. And they're trying to write some ideas about fair rules for contract poultry production and hog production and so on. But maybe we think about contract rules in general and think about fairness within those contract rules. There could be multiple ways, but these are policy things that have to be done. So while I applaud the administration, I'm not sure what their reach can be. And I don't know what other folks think.
The previous administration,
all,
the Obama administration, went through that whole Department of Justice set of hearings all over the country, and accumulated a huge dossier of thousands of testimonies from farmers about the concentration and the damage that it was doing, and then nothing happened.
You know, Mary, quick reaction. I love every single thing you said. I'm your biggest fan. But and thank you, Elizabeth, for that comment as well. One of the points I didn't get to, and it actually aligns with this, is that one thing that the Federation has done is we filed a motion to intervene in the litigation that is pending that has halted the implementation of Section 1005. And to Mary's point, their case law and the federal courts and the Supreme Court, those structures really enable white supremacy to persist, and all of the symptoms that bear the fruit that it bears, and even to the point where the advocacy work that I do, I was invited to draft a piece of legislation for the state of Florida. They specifically asked me to draft a piece of legislation that was going to help Black farmers in Florida. And so I did that. This was recently, maybe in the past 2 weeks, that I got the feedback from them. And what they told me was that it's not going to work for Florida. There's just not political will to do anything like this. And so these are the responses that we get. The federal level, the Biden administration and the USDA have both put forth a really strong set of language and talking points around racial equity in particular. But then when it comes to the point of actually legislating those differences, that has not started to happen. And that's a huge paradigm shift. And when I was in law school, actually, for one of my final papers, I asked, like, other countries rewrite their constitutions. Like, it's not, there is precedent for even going all the way back, because fundamentally our constitution, with all the great things about it, was significantly flawed. I mean, it was drafted by people who were, owned slaves, for example. And so I think that there are ways in which racial disparities are so baked into the cake that all the most altruistic talking points, they're just not going to get the work done. And agriculture, it's the origin of this country, and those racial equities, those disparities for the landless, the folks that have the smaller landholders, that's always been a very entrenched disparity in this country. And undoing that will not occur during any one administration. And that's why it takes all of our collective efforts and all of the solidarity to bring those questions to the forefront. I mean, I didn't know that a private person could fly to the moon. But one of the things that when I was in North Carolina, when I went to the Wright Museum, and I saw that it was 1903 that the first plane took off, and then we had a man on the moon, like in less than 100 years. Like, if we can have technology advance and leap, like, in leaps and bounds in such short periods of time, the decimation to our environment, the devastation to our racial equity, our humanity, that can also be fixed if we have the political will of the people, the rural power to advance that agenda. So I think there's some great talking points from this administration, but it's going to take us to implement it.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And I think, someone wrote a question in the chat, is dairy a place to test some of these things? And I agree, it's hard to take on all commodities at once. On one level, we have the opportunity of the Farm Bill. I mean, in our system, we negotiate a lot of these big policy structures every 5-ish years. And now's the time for a full court press on the Farm Bill issues that I think, Mary talked about, the subsidy structures, what is it that we support, and what kind of crops and systems do we de-risk by putting a really good safety net under farmers, and which things do we not? Fresh vegetables, very risky, and diversified farms with many crops, very risky. We don't adequately provide support if there's crop failure or market crashes, whereas corn and soybeans, we love to support the expansion of that. So I do think, going in for those really structural things that are impacting like the vast swath of crops is super important. And then at the same time, I think regionally, maybe it is like, maybe we pick some things that are most strategic. I think up in New England, the Northeast, the dairy is probably a good place to test some of this stuff right now. There's a lot of disruption in the industry. You've seen, organic farmers, like organic was kind of this promised land. Like, this is a way that farmers can come together and get a higher price because they've organized their production around some ways that consumers are identifying that they want, like ecological production practices, and people were willing to pay a higher price. Well, now you're seeing the big multinational corporations like just drop farmers. I mean, Danone, okay, we'll give them a cookie. They gave the farmers a year to figure out a new place to send their milk. But I mean, this is showing the precarity. At the same time, in the region, you have some movements building, the migrant justice, the Milk with Dignity campaigns, where organized people really figured out, like, well, let's pick Ben and Jerry's as the shiny, fluffy vertebrate that is making a lot of claims about their social and economic justice in their system, but the workers on those dairy farms, the Latino workers, were not getting paid fair wages. But they also realized in working with the farmers that the farmers weren't getting paid a fair price. So that was has been an opportunity. So I think, picking dairy in these regions where we still have a little bit of a base of production that's distributed, it could be really wise to call attention and to get people's to come get on the bus with us. Because of, all the reasons that people care about their ecologically beautiful landscapes that need working farms. So that's the example for the Northeast. So I see that Annie has her hand up, so I'm going to give her the floor.
Oh, Sarah, I mean, I always love listening to, people who are so passionate about the work that they do. So it's always great to see you. Yeah, at the risk of, sounding like a broken record, I shared about the cooperative food utility concept. I've been fascinated by it, and I'm not seeing a lot of explanation as to why it won't work, except people are scared of it. And I'm a big history fan, and I like getting to like the how and the why. How did we get here? And it's fascinating and horrifying to me because, in meeting and talking to Dr. John Eichert, if you don't know Dr. John Eichert, please look up his videos. It's IKERD. His Moses keynote from 2020, like, I don't know how many times I've watched that, over the last like 2 years, just because it's like church for me. Because I've never in my years of doing this work, encountered a man like Dr. Eichert, who is as stereotypical old white dude who built his career on, taking out family farms because they decided that they were too expensive, and is actually out there admitting it and acknowledging it. Now, he had to have a near-death experience first, but it's true. I met him when he came here to talk to us about our 303D waters. And in Indiana, where I'm at, we have like 90% of our waterways are 303D classified. Now, I think that's really disingenuous, because if they said 93% of our waterways are catastrophically contaminated, people might take it a little more seriously, but that's not how they term it. It's that 303D, which, well, what does that mean? And it seems so much less threatening until you get into looking at it. And hearing Dr. Eichert speak, I was a little skeptical when I first went, because I'm like, what is this old dude going to tell me? And he literally brought the roof down, with his just like candid, I don't know, just like owning of like the destruction that they've caused to our communities, to our farms, to our land in a generation. And so like, I am like wanting to grab people and shake them by their shoulders and like tell them to wake up, because it was the 70s. It wasn't that long ago, the 70s, when they decided that farmers were too expensive. So let's get rid of farmers and try and make everything machines and chemicals. And it was a huge mistake, and they didn't care how much it cost. They didn't care how risky it was, transitioning farmers out of growing fruits and vegetables and processing stuff and whatever. They wanted their money. And so they forced people out. And if they could do it, in the 70s, we can write it. We have to write it. And, it sucks that that's the work that is laid on us, by their efforts. But, at the same time, unfortunately, like, this is the perfect time for it, because COVID has, I felt like Chicken Little for years, running around telling people like, consolidation is horrible. The global food chain is fragile. Like, I consider it a national security crisis that, we, import so much of what we consume. And it's like, it doesn't make sense to me. It's like a bully building a treehouse, and throwing flaming bags of poo at everybody and then going, oh yeah, I forgot to pack a lunch. Can you send me some food? It doesn't make any sense. And, that's the fight that we have, ahead of us. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast. And it is going to take a lot of determination and forcing through, Sarah, that, political lack of will and whatnot. We've really got to bring as much power as we can to this next farm bill. And I mean, like, the young people, bring the young people, because this is their future that, we're working on. And as a, bridge type person myself, I see, the frustration and the desire to be more involved and more impactful in the young people. And I see, kind of the, frankly, people have been doing this work are tired. Been doing it for a long time, made some incredible, progress, but we have a huge lift ahead of us. And now is the time to do it because we have lost so many, and we're about to lose so much more farmland. And like looking at the American Farmland Trust like numbers before COVID was terrifying. I don't even want to know what it looks like now, because that just like blows my mind to think of like how many of the people who we've lost in this last year and a half, were farmers or somehow involved in our food system. We have huge gaps and things, and now's the time to make a drastic change. And sorry, the cooperative food utility, Dr. Eichert has presented on it and been writing about it for a number of years. It's based on the model of a rural electric cooperative utility. And the thing is to understand the specific difference between a cooperative and a cooperative utility, because a cooperative is a nonprofit and a cooperative utility can be investor managed. And the trick is the devil's in the details. It's all in how we write it. And if you say the investors have to be, people who live here, who are, processing or who are participating in this, and the food and everything goes to, we can specify where that food goes to, what our boundaries are, what our criteria is, and stick to it, because they've lost the power. The same as the Great, Resignation, they've lost the power, and it's going to continue to go if we step up and make our demands, made. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you very
Great.
much, Ani.
Great.
A cooperative is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. But I definitely think that the cooperative business model is, if we're going to continue within the current paradigm, I think it's a shift in the right direction of a business model. And as many may know, the Federation, our headquarters is in Atlanta, Georgia, but the laws, the authorizing laws for cooperatives in the South are so repressive that we are not established in Georgia. We're chartered in Washington, DC. And there are lots of states that don't want cooperatives to be formed. And I think there's a lot of convergence between the workers' rights movement and the cooperatives. And I really am excited about what's happening right now, because, COVID-19 is a wake-up call for us. And I think that if we miss the message and if we rush to get back to normal as quickly as possible, that will be our version of those folks that we're criticizing right now. I think that this is a very critical moment. African Americans were telling our neighbors and friends that we were being brutalized by the police, and it was just not taken seriously until we were all trapped in our homes and forced to watch a public lynching. And I think that that is a turning point for our nation. And if our nation does not take racial equity seriously after that, if we don't take workers' rights seriously after that, if we don't take workers' rights seriously after all of the devastation that COVID-19 has caused to communities of color, who were the majority of the frontline workers, then it'll be shame on us. And I think that that's what the moment is that we have that's at stake right now. I think we have an opportunity to truly build that better and think about what does that look like? Because, even race isn't a construct that has existed in perpetuity. It's a relatively recent socio-political construct. And so for us to feel so committed to perpetuating a system that's, a white supremacist, capitalistic, patriarchal system, because it feels like our normal, we should all our whatever anxieties or fears you felt when you were in lockdown should be triggered anytime you hear that we're just trying to swiftly get to the next step. We really need to download the lesson that the earth showed us. We are doing things, human beings. There's a really good ad right now with a dinosaur talking about how they went extinct. And I love it so much, because it's like, yes. It's like the dinosaurs could not stop the asteroid or whatever it was, but we can stop the climate change. Yeah. And I think cooperatives, I think collective ownership, the commons, the concept of commons, and the concept of our humanity bringing us together being so much more important than what's in people's pockets. I think we have to have a fundamental human rights paradigm that is rooting the future of what our food system looks like. And if we miss this opportunity, shame on us.
Can I just
Very-
follow up on a couple of things? There was a question way up in the chat about technology, and all I'll say about technology is it's neither good nor bad, but technology is always placed into our current social and economic relationships. And if they're crappy, the technology's crappy. So technology won't allow us to do anything different than what we're already experiencing. We have to work on the social and economic relationship changes. The second thing I would say is, I think it's not just the 1970s that created our current problems. We've had problems with the way we've been putting together agriculture for a long, long time, right? And Tom Lyson traces this in his book, Civic Agriculture, the first 2 chapters of that book, great history of what happens when you start to specialize, which we started doing in the late 1800s. But really the 20th century was a history of, revolutions that really displaced people from agriculture, from their communities. So it really lifted out our economic relationships from our social relationships all through the 20th century. And we kept trying to gain control of those. We tried to gain control of that with the New Deal. We tried to gain control of that with antitrust, right? But we've been under pressure. We keep lifting our we keep separating production consumption and lifting our economic relationships out of our social relationships. And without doing that, without addressing those critical things, it's not just the 1970s, it's not just the 1950s. And it's a long period of time, right, that we've been doing this. And so we have to recognize that, but then there's been people resisting it all the time. And so we can learn a lot from history, lots of history. And the things that the Federation has done in their historical period, the things that the Farmer Labor League did in Minnesota. And then I would finally say that there's some really, I think the thing that I was in Iceland during the pandemic, and I heard Trump's order to keep the meat packing plants open. And I screamed my head off, and that my neighbors were like, what's going on? And I was so upset because that was sentencing people to death. And it was that whole meat packing thing that happened at the onset of COVID was the collision of all the irrationalities that we see in our food system. We had farmers that had to slaughter their animals, euthanize their animals. That is awful. Can you imagine that from a farm perspective? It's awful. We had all that corn that was in that pork that wasn't utilized, but yet the way we got people to utilize, we got that supply chain fixed was because we sent people to their deaths, workers to their death. If that is not an irrational system, an unfair system, an unjust system, then I don't know what is. And I think that's the stuff we have to, I'm sorry, I'm very passionate about that. But it's one of the examples that just highlights how stupid the system is, the way we've organized it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, this question of certainly all of us here who have worked on kind of re-embedding the social relationships into the economics, or, making sure that the social relationships are dominant in these systems rather than some idea of economic whatever, efficiency, rationality, all those scary words that are used to apologize and excuse terrible things. We know how long it's a long process to figure out how to rebuild and build anew these systems. So I think about the meat packing system here in Wisconsin. we actually still have a fair amount of processing at the small scale in Wisconsin, but we need to figure out how to support and maintain those. And, our state, our governor, they're all excited. They put $200,000 in the budget to support small meat packing plants. And we're like, that's like one corner of one, like that's one cement block in one corner. And meanwhile, they put like $5 million into exports. And so that, again, that's the very much looking at like, where are we putting our priorities and figuring out the long game. Anyone who's done cooperative development or collective enterprise development, it takes a lot of time, because that's the thing, you're replacing some of the speed of money with the slowness of trust and community. And that, and that's the other thing that I see is when we're working on these things and we're seeing that, okay, the USDA or the states, or maybe there's private money that's coming in to support us rebuilding the food system, we have to demand that they value and support the soft skills, as you might call them. Like, we need the organizers and the facilitators and the people that are on the ground that are keeping people coming together, organizing the meetings so we can understand our shared values and we can build, but we need to build viable businesses. Because like right now we're still in the old system. And as I say, like, shit costs money. And so you got to figure out like how to actually have functioning businesses. But we need to change the tire on the car when the car is running down the street. So, it's challenging, but we need the people to organize these. And so, we should be asking any grants or programs that are supporting like climate smart agricultural transformation, say, show me the detail in the grant guideline that mandates that you have to pay local organizers, from the place that you're trying to change agricultural systems in, because that's what we need, along with, people that may be coming from outside the community to align resources. But that's my kind of, we need the soft skills, because this is not easy work. Go ahead. How do you say your name? Ani?
It's Ani. So
Ani,
it's Stephanie.
okay.
I just dropped the Steph part because my sister-in-law is also Stephanie, and I don't like Steph, so I just dropped it, and so she gets to be Stephanie, and I get to be Ani. So I'm Tia Ani.
Great.
It was easier than like trying to figure out which inflection you meant. Oh fudge! Now I forgot my question. No. Yeah, I had a question. We were talking about land, and I'm curious about kind of like the state of land transition in the Northeast, and if you guys are seeing the sort of trends and issues that we are seeing here. I actually ended up driving 6.5 hours down to the south side of Indiana to go to a Corn and Soybeans Association meeting with my mentor, who's a Mennonite. So a Black chick and a Mennonite walked into a Corn and Soybeans meeting. It sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. In order to talk to Senator Todd Young, because his staff was sending me automated responses, and I don't get automated responses. And so I went down there to talk to him. So I'm like, we have issues, and I'm smart. I know that when I walk into a room, they're all like, is she lost? And it's like, I didn't get 7 hours lost in cornfield. I'm actually invited here. And so when Todd got there, like, he totally did a double take, because he totally was not expecting to see a Black chick at a Corn and Soybeans meeting. And sorry, it's like one of my favorite things to do. And I'm like sitting there and, the discussion starts and everything, and I'm just minding my business and listening, because I make a point to be respectful. And those who are, from the area, they had things they wanted to say, and I wanted to hear what they had to say. And it turns out that they were upset and concerned because down there where they're at, right on the Ohio River, they're having problems with a lot of families have gone out of business in the grain elevator business. And a lot of multinational corporations, non-American companies are buying the grain elevators and putting them back into business. And the farmers are getting an even worse deal than they were before, but then even less money is going into the community. And then also they're concerned about the levees, like the locks and dams and everything on the river, because they're in disrepair and need to be repaired, and neither state, is like wanting to take responsibility for it. And so they were trying to get our, senator to, make sure that the infrastructure money is there for it. And, I was like, and that speaks exactly to the reason I'm down here, because I, up in the northern part of the state, watching entire communities disappear off the map as farmers are selling, and it's going to developers and to, Chinese and South American, or, companies that are making like little, like corporate farm, deserts in the middle of our rural communities, and completely wiping communities off because there's not enough money for, fire people or for post office or schools. And so I was like, what are we doing about this to preserve our American farmland? Because like those are where we're getting a lot of the, the non-point, contamination to our waters and stuff, because they drive everyone off the property except for corporate, employees. And so there's no way to get in there and like, observe things and monitor things. And it's a whole nightmare. And his answer was, well, if they're coming in and they're buying up the grain elevators and stuff and putting them back in business, that's helping the economy, right? And it's like, no, because that money's not staying here in the United States, and you're giving them tax, rebates and incentives and all that stuff, so they're not even paying taxes on the stuff that they're doing. Don't get me started on Amazon or Walmart's dairy, which is like right in my county, and that's a whole nother thing that I'm like writing a whole thing on right now. But is that something that you are also seeing in like the Northeast or wherever your training is from? Where I don't know who's tracking, where the transition of these lands are going. And, if we're not even, like controlling the lands within our borders, and much less being able to have people on it producing things, like that seems like it should be a bigger point of concern when it comes to like land stewardship and the future.
Yeah, thanks.
Does that
Does
make sense?
anyone who's on from the Northeast know kind of what your trends are in land ownership?
I would say it depends on where in the Northeast you are. Where I live in the Hudson Valley, there's definitely an interest in development because people are migrating out of the city, and that's really putting a lot of farmland at risk. And while there is an effort to preserve farmland or to preserve open space, at least, that land doesn't always stay in farming, or if it does stay in farming, it's not owned by the people farming the land. So it's sort of, and I bet Liz has something to say about this. And I know that there's several experts on this call. I imagine Susan could speak to what's going on in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania area, but it really depends. How close you live to the I-95 corridor really impacts the development pressures on your land, and then the further out you get into rural spaces. But I know where I live, which is right near the I-95 corridor, there's a lot of development pressure, and also a lot of, wealthy landowners who want to keep their land undeveloped, but don't necessarily want to like have an equity lens to how their land is used and farmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Tracy. And I think that brings it back to Dania, just thinking about wealth creation that, in land ownership, that's been such the foundation of the way that people have been able to amass wealth in this country. And private property, that's its main goal, but by having Black farmers and Black communities excluded intentionally from that ability has created this extremely long-lasting inequality. And so as we're looking at these major shifts in land ownership across the country, and like Tracy said, it does really depend on where you're at. That this is a critical time also. I know Lisa from National Family Farm Coalition, they've been tracking the TIA CREF and the way that some of these pension funds are trying to invest in land as a stable for them to stabilize their funds. And so there's a lot of work to be done. Lisa, I don't know if you want to give a little blurb on the stuff that you're tracking as far as corporate and pension fund land ownership.
Well, thank you, and thanks, not Sarah Lloyd, but we are trying to, yes, we have been watching TIA's investment in speculation in farmland, both in the US and other countries around the world, particularly Brazil. And I will drop some links into the chat that I think will explain better what's going on. But they own, it's just an incredible amount of farmland around the world, and using pension funds from people and employees at universities and other public institutions. So there are several ways that we're trying to deal with that, from the faculty senates requiring changes in their investments with TIAA, and also just badgering TIAA to wake up and smell coffee and do the right thing, because they do promote themselves as sustainable land, I guess I don't call it speculators, but that they're partnering with sustainable corporations and businesses, but they're really not. So I will drop some links, and thank you for watching that. So if you have money in TIAA, you might look elsewhere, and you also have that opportunity to raise these concerns to them. Thanks.
So we're running up with just a couple minutes left. Mary, Dania, do you have any parting words for our assembly here?
Organize.
I completely agree. I think solidarity is key. Our heirs property work is a significant place that I'm watching for land retention and transition. And that's especially the case because a lot of the climate smart ag and carbon credit market is going to incentivize additional land grabs. And heir property owners are going to be especially vulnerable to that. If they don't take advantage of the heir property lending funds that are available to help clear title, I think there are going to be a lot of ways in which they continue to be vulnerable. But I really, Mary summed it up with that one word. I think we all need to keep these conversations going with the Farm Bill coming up, keeping our eye on the ball. There's going to be a lot of moving targets, I think, that kind of look very, very close to exactly what we want. And I remember when I was little, my grandmother used to tell me, the devil doesn't look scary. The devil looks like the closest thing to what you actually want. And so that's something that I think about in my policy advocacy work, that closest next approximation can be the most dangerous compromise. And so as we work together, we can keep each other accountable and our eyes on the prize. Thank you all for your time.
Great. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity to come together, jumping off from the disparity to parity work, to move towards solidarity, to build build the new systems. I look forward to continuing to see all of you in the struggle. And enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Tracy.